What if the next pope wasn't even a religious leader? The question landed like a thunderclap in the middle of the most watched episode of the Future Now podcast. Over 3 million people were tuned in live, most of them sipping coffee, doom-scrolling on their phones, or commuting through morning traffic when Elon Musk dropped the line that made every jaw tighten and every brow furrow. The host, James Falco, paused mid-sip, blinking. Wait, hold on. Are you saying the next pope might not even be a priest? Elon leaned back in his chair, eyes calm, voice even. I'm saying, look, it's 2025. We're about to have AI running corporations, we're planning colonies on Mars, and most of the world experiences religion through live streams and hashtags. So, yeah. It might be time for the church to think outside the robe. The internet exploded. Clips of the moment went viral before the hour was up. One TikTok edit, with dramatic music and captions in all caps, Elon Musk says next pope might not be a priest. Hit 5 million views before dinner. Memes rolled out faster than news outlets could fact-check. Reddit threads lit up. Twitter Spaces ran for hours. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, everyone debated it. But the real buzz wasn't the quote. It was who Elon named as his unexpected choice. I recently met someone who kind of rewired the way I think about belief. A man named Father Michael Carraway. Ex-firefighter. Priest. Lost everything, and still stands taller than most men I know. I'm not saying he should be pope. But I am saying he's the kind of soul who could change how we see the role. The room in the studio fell silent, not just from the host, but from the audience worldwide who, for once, didn't quite know what to comment first. Who was Father Michael? Why him? Was this a joke? A stunt? But Musk didn't blink. He didn't smirk or explain. He let the weight of the idea hang, like a challenge to be explored. And so it began. Across the country, in a small mission house on the edge of Phoenix, Arizona, Father Michael Carraway was stacking canned food for the shelter when his assistant burst into the room, iPhone in hand, face pale. Father Mike, you need to see this. Michael, still in a dusty old hoodie over his collar, wiped his hands and took the phone. He watched. His eyebrows raised. He watched again. He said nothing for a full minute. Then he blinked, handed back the phone, and quietly muttered, "That's going to be a problem. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning." What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The Vatican didn't respond publicly, not yet. But behind closed doors, the pressure was already boiling. Cardinal Neri, senior advisor to the Pope and known hardliner, slapped the headline down on the oak table in the private council chamber. "This is madness," he growled. "A celebrity atheist recommending a priest no one's even heard of. And people are taking it seriously." Cardinal Dawson, younger, more open-minded, leaned forward. "But what if it's not madness? What if it's a signal? The world is shifting, Neri. Perhaps, the Spirit speaks in strange ways. Spare me the mysticism. The papacy is not a popularity contest." "No," Dawson replied, calm. "But it's also not immune to the world around it. Look outside. The people are watching. Listening." Back in the US, James Falco uploaded a follow-up video that night. Today, Elon Musk gave us a glimpse into a future where faith and technology don't just coexist, they collaborate. But it also raised real questions. Can a man outside the hierarchy of the church really become pope? Has it ever happened? And what does that say about the future of leadership? He turned to camera, leaning in. Let's break it down. Here's what we know. In less than 48 hours, Father Michael's name was trending across multiple platforms. Old footage of him from years ago, delivering aid in Brazil, comforting refugees, praying in bombed-out churches, surfaced. His quiet strength, his lack of vanity, his refusal to comment publicly on Elon's statement only fueled the fire. Some called him a modern-day Francis of Assisi. Others said it was a PR stunt. A few just tweeted, "Make him Pope. I'd go back to church." But none of them really knew the man. Not yet. In a quiet chapel later that night, lit only by candles and shadows, Father Michael sat alone. His hands rested on his lap, clasped gently. His eyes weren't on the altar, but on the worn wooden floor beneath it. "Lord," he whispered. "I didn't ask for this." He wasn't afraid. He was unsure. Not of himself, but of what the world might do with this sudden attention. He knew how fast hope could become manipulation. He'd seen it in war. In politics. Even in faith. The silence was heavy. But he stayed, eyes closed, waiting, not for an answer, but for peace. Meanwhile, Elon tweeted again. "People fear change because it unseats the old. But what if the seat itself needs to evolve? #future of faith #next pope." Before he became the richest man on Earth, or maybe Mars, before the rocket launches, the internet-breaking tweets, and now the global spiritual conversation, Elon Musk was just a boy. A quiet, pale-skinned kid with a mind moving faster than his words could keep up, growing up in Pretoria, South Africa. He spent more time with books than people. Science fiction was his church, Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, his prophets. The universe wasn't a divine mystery to him, it was a sandbox waiting to be reshaped. By age 10, he was coding. By 12, he had sold his first video game. But faith? That was never part of the program. "I wasn't raised with much of it," Elon admitted in a rare interview years ago. God was something people talked about when they didn't understand how electricity worked. His childhood was hard. His father, Elon Musk, was brilliant but often cold. Their relationship was strained, bordering on toxic. Elon's escape came in the form of circuit boards, model rockets, and books stacked ceiling high. He was bullied viciously. At one point, he was thrown down a flight of stairs and ended up hospitalized. It was during that recovery, jaw wired shut, ribs bruised, that he made the silent vow, "I will build a world where I don't have to run anymore." That vow became a mission. In college, Elon stood out not because he was flashy, but because he didn't stop. While others were drinking or partying, he was mapping Mars. He majored in physics and economics, but his real education came from asking one question over and over. What's the most important problem in the world, and how can I solve it? That led to Zip2. Then PayPal. Then Tesla. Then SpaceX. And every step of the way, the same patterns emerged. He would identify a system, broken, outdated, bureaucratic, and tear it apart to rebuild it. More efficient. Smarter. Leaner. He didn't just want to change industries. He wanted to reshape humanity. Still, the one system he never touched, or seemed to have much interest in, was religion. Until now. People always assumed Elon was atheist. He confirmed it, in part, but often nuanced the label. "I don't pray," he once said in a Clubhouse Q&A, "but I do believe in trying to do the most good. If that makes me spiritual, fine. But I think the universe doesn't care what you believe, it cares what you do." That belief hardened when his first child, Nevada, died at 10 weeks old. SIDS. No warning. No way to stop it. Just, gone. The loss nearly broke him. For weeks, he disappeared from the media, from work, from friends. Privately, Elon confided in one close friend, "If there's a God, he wasn't watching that night." From that moment on, Elon stopped looking upward, and focused entirely outward. On Mars. On AI. On building escape plans from pain too deep for any chapel. So what changed? How does a man so rooted in logic and loss end up publicly endorsing a priest, no, a potential pope? It wasn't religion that drew him in. It was curiosity. 6 months before the podcast that shook the internet, Elon had flown to Brazil for a private sustainability summit in the Amazon region. On a break between panels, he visited a mission outpost that was using solar tech donated by Tesla to power an entire village. There, he met Father Michael. He expected a barefoot priest with a cross and empty words. What he found was a man rebuilding homes with his bare hands, running a mobile clinic with only 2 nurses, and teaching tech literacy to children in Portuguese and broken English. Michael didn't preach. He didn't ask for donations. He didn't even seem that interested in Elon. Until the two sat down over a small fire that night. So, Elon asked, chewing on cassava roots, "How do you reconcile your God with all this suffering?" Michael stirred the coals gently. "You assume he prevents it. You're saying God just lets pain happen. That sounds cruel." Michael looked up, steady and calm. "I'm saying, pain is the one thing that strips us of illusion. In suffering, you find what's real. And maybe, just maybe, what's holy." Elon was silent. For once, without rebuttal. "And what's real to you?" he asked finally. Michael smiled. "Love. Service. And hope. Especially when it seems foolish." It wasn't a conversion. Elon didn't leave Brazil baptized or reborn. But something about Michael stuck. The way he carried himself. The integrity. The kind of leadership that didn't come from books, power, or even belief, but from how he walked through hell and kept going anyway. It was rational. Elon admired systems that worked. And Father Michael worked, in a way even rockets couldn't explain. So when the topic of the papacy came up on the Future Now, Elon didn't plan to name names. But his mind went back to that firelight, and the man who didn't try to save the world, just helped the next person in front of him. In the days after the podcast aired, Elon declined interview requests. He refused to clarify his position. His X, formerly Twitter, account remained active, sure, but quiet about the church. Until one reply popped up on a trending thread that read, "So Elon wants to make the Pope a SpaceX chaplain now?" His reply came minutes later. "No. But maybe the Pope should be someone who actually gives a damn." At first glance, Father Michael Carraway didn't look like someone who might one day be considered for the papacy. He didn't carry the polished charisma of a cardinal. He didn't wear the ornate robes, the rings, the ceremonial presence. Most days, he wore a faded gray hoodie over his clerical collar, work jeans with worn knees, and shoes coated in red dust from the Arizona desert. But those who knew him didn't see the wardrobe. They saw the man who showed up at 5 a.m. every day to make breakfast for the homeless. The man who sat beside dying addicts in alleyways when no one else would come. The man who led prayer in an emergency shelter not with lofty words, but with silence and a hand held tight. And like every saint who ever walked the earth, Michael carried a wound. He was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 1985. Middle of 3 children. His father was a steelworker, his mother a public school teacher. Theirs was a loud, loving, Irish Catholic home full of music, bruises, and grace said before every meal. From a young age, Michael wanted to help people. Not in the grand, ambitious way of politicians or billionaires. Just, in the way his dad helped a neighbor shovel snow. In the way his mom took in foster kids when the system failed. His first calling wasn't the church, it was fire. At 21, he joined the fire department. 6 months later, he met Sarah. She was everything he wasn't, fierce, sharp-tongued, hilarious. A trauma nurse with tattoos and no time for sugarcoating life. They fell hard. Married within a year. 2 years later, they had a baby girl, Emma. Life was brutal, beautiful, and full. Until the night that burned it all down. It was a warehouse fire. Arson, they would learn later. Michael was inside when the roof caved. A teammate pulled him out, but he woke up 2 days later in a hospital bed to learn that Sarah and Emma, who had stopped by with dinner, had been caught in the blast before he even got the call. They were gone before he could say goodbye. The grief unmade him. For weeks, he barely spoke. When he did, it was mostly to scream at God. Why her? Why Emma? Why not me? He left the firehouse. Stopped going to Massachusetts, lived in his truck. Then one night, he saw a kid, barely 15, bleeding out in a gutter behind a gas station. Gang fight gone bad. No ambulance in sight. Michael wrapped the wound in his own shirt, talked him through the pain, waited for help. The boy lived. And that night, something cracked open in him again. I couldn't save my own, he later told a friend. But maybe I could help someone else keep theirs. He went back to the church, not for answers, but for silence. And it was there, in the dim echo of stained glass and old pews, that he found his calling again. He entered seminary at age 30. Late by most standards. But his professors said he carried wisdom beyond textbooks. During his training, he requested an assignment in Brazil, serving in favelas most clergy refused to enter. He worked alongside engineers, builders, and social workers. He fought disease, corruption, human trafficking. He didn't talk much about it when he returned, just said he learned more about Jesus there than in any lecture. When he came back to the U.S., he requested to serve not in a cathedral, but at St. Luke's Mission Shelter in Phoenix. No congregation. No stained glass. Just tents, soup, and sand. Exactly where he belonged. The day Elon Musk said his name on air, Father Michael had just returned from digging a trench behind the shelter to help improve flood drainage. He'd spent the morning cleaning out a rodent infestation from the women's dorms. He didn't check social media. He didn't care for it. It was Sister Joanna, the missions director, who told him. Elon Musk said you should be the next pope, she said flatly, as she handed him a wet mop. He blinked. Well, he's clearly been out in the sun too long. But over the next 48 hours, the world came crashing in. The media showed up first. Then the online hate. Then the conspiracy theorists, the fanboys, the pilgrims. Through it all, Michael kept working. When a reporter asked him if he wanted to be pope, he shook his head and said, I want people to be fed. I want addicts to be seen. I want the lonely to know they matter. Whatever role helps do that, fine. But titles don't make miracles. People do. It wasn't what the world expected. It was better. A few days later, Elon sent a private message. A single sentence. People like you shouldn't stay hidden. Michael replied. People like me should. That's the point. To which Elon simply responded. Too late. The United Nations Summit on Human Sustainability wasn't exactly Father Michael Carraway's scene. It was held in a luxury complex overlooking Geneva Lake, where billionaires, scientists, and world leaders gathered under banners that read, "The future is now." There were smart glasses at every table, hologram translators whispering in delegates' ears, and coffee so expensive Michael was sure the beans had names. He didn't come by invitation. He came because the shelter's tech partners had entered him into a global humanitarian competition sponsored by Tesla Foundation. Somehow, without knowing, he'd been selected as a finalist. When the foundation staff called, he tried to decline. When they insisted, he tried to disappear. Eventually, Sister Joanna booked his flight without telling him. Think of it as field research, she'd said, stuffing a blazer into his duffel. You'll survive. God made you stubborn. So here he was. A former firefighter turned priest, sitting in a room full of crypto kings and AI theorists, feeling like a relic in a museum of tomorrow. And then Elon Musk walked in. The air shifted. The way it does when a famous actor walks into a restaurant, or when lightning is about to strike. People didn't clap. They turned, whispered, reached for phones. The man himself moved casually, in a dark jacket and black tee, like he'd just stepped out of a coffee shop. Their eyes met across the floor. Elon smiled. Michael blinked, looked away. But later that evening, during the closing panel on faith, ethics, and the future of humanity, they were seated side by side on stage. Two worlds. One mic each. The moderator, a sleek-voiced MIT professor, opened with a question to Elon: "You've built rockets, reimagined energy, and now you've hinted at religious transformation. What role do you believe faith plays in humanity's future?" Elon leaned into the mic. "If humanity's going to survive, not just technologically, but emotionally, we have to integrate ethics into innovation. And for a lot of people, those ethics come from belief systems. But they need to evolve." Then, he gestured lightly toward Michael. "Which is why I believe voices like Father Michael's are more important than ever. He doesn't preach dogma. He lives service. If we're going to build the future, we need to learn from people like him." The moderator turned, intrigued. "Father Michael, your response?" Michael adjusted his collar, eyes steady. "I think technology is like fire. It can warm a home, or burn it down. What matters is who's holding the torch. I've seen miracles in code. I've seen disasters in pulpits. The tool isn't holy or evil. The hands are." Elon nodded, impressed. The moderator leaned in. "Do you think faith leaders have failed to keep up with modern ethics?" Michael paused. "I think faith leaders sometimes forget their job isn't to control the world, it's to heal it." Elon smiled wider. "You two seem to agree more than you disagree," the moderator noted. "Until the next question," Michael said. Laughter rolled across the room. The debate lasted an hour. Topics ranged from genetic engineering to space colonization to economic disparity and the soul's place in the digital age. And though they disagreed on many details, something unusual happened between them. They listened. Really listened. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't heated. But it was real. After the panel, Michael found himself outside alone, leaning on a stone rail overlooking the lake. The night was cool. Stars swirled above in ancient silence. Elon approached quietly, two paper cups in hand. "Not sure what your rules are, but this is just black coffee." Michael smirked. "I've broken worse." They stood in silence for a moment, sipping, watching the ripples. "Why me?" Michael asked finally. Elon didn't answer right away. "You didn't try to sell anything," he said. "Not your church. Not yourself. You just showed up. That's rare." Michael gave a quiet laugh. "I show up because I've got nowhere else to go. That's the kind of person I'd follow into a crisis. I'm not leading anyone anywhere." Elon turned to him, serious now. "Maybe you should." Behind them, photographers were trying to be discreet. A drone buzzed faintly above. Somewhere in a live stream, millions watched a caption scroll across the bottom of a news segment. "Elon Musk and Father Michael, tech titan meets the people's priest." Back at the Vatican, in a high-ceilinged chamber lined with crimson drapes and whispers older than empires, Cardinal Neri watched the footage in silence. He did not smile. He turned to an aide. "Get me everything on this Father Caraway. Where he trained. Who endorsed him. I want to know if this man bleeds gold or sin." The aide nodded and left quickly. And in the shelter back home, Sister Joanna held her phone up to the volunteers, who were gathered around an old TV. "He did it," she whispered, smiling. "He held his own with Musk." One of the volunteers, a recovering addict named Trey, raised his hands and grinned. "Our priest might be the next pope, huh?" Joanna chuckled. "God help us if he finds out." But Father Michael already knew the storm was coming. He could feel it in the way people stared, the emails flooding in, the subtle shift in how people now greeted him. Less like a friend. More like a figure. And as the night deepened over Geneva, he whispered to himself. Keep me grounded. Keep me honest. And keep me far from pedestals. The apostolic palace rarely pulsed with urgency. Time moved slowly within its ancient stone walls, echoing in candlelit corridors and hushed Latin prayers. But this week, urgency had a name, Father Michael Carraway. The global media had named him the People's Priest. Elon Musk had called him the kind of soul who could lead a generation. But inside the Curia, many cardinals had a different name for him. Cardinal Salvatore Neri, stoic, razor-sharp, and fiercely loyal to tradition, stood at the window of his private office overlooking St. Peter's Square. His lips were thin, pressed tight as he reviewed the dossier on his desk. A manila folder, thicker than it should have been. Inside, Michael's seminary records, mission reports from Brazil, witness accounts from Phoenix, even a brief psychological profile. He's not scandalous, Neri muttered. But he is unpredictable. Across from him sat Cardinal Dawson, younger by 20 years, and with a look that often bordered on dangerous curiosity. Unpredictability isn't always a vice, Dawson said gently. The Holy Spirit doesn't work on a schedule. Neri scoffed. We are not debating theology. We are guarding the church. Dawson tapped the folder. Or resisting renewal. The two men stared at each other. One defending the walls. The other nudging open a door. Meanwhile, deep within the archives, a Jesuit researcher named Father Mateo was quietly fact-checking an obscure question. Can someone outside the College of Cardinals become Pope? The answer was, yes. Rare. Wildly improbable. But technically allowed under canon law. If the college were to unite in vote, if the spirit, or social pressure, moved them, any baptized male Catholic could, in theory, become Pope. Even a priest. Even one who didn't want it. News outlets began speculating. Could Father Michael be a dark horse in the next conclave? The Church's viral dilemma, is this humble priest the future? Vatican breaks silence, sort of. The sort of came in the form of a press release from the Holy See. We commend all servants of the poor and thank those who uplift Christ's mission in humble service. The Holy Spirit moves as he wills, and the Church listens, always with prayerful discernment. Which said everything. And nothing. In a quiet Vatican hallway, Cardinal Maria Alvarez, a rising star from Argentina and one of the few female theologians granted high advisory status, spoke quietly with Dawson over espresso. He's not their idea of a pope, she said, flipping through photos of Michael distributing food, bandaging a migrant's leg, speaking with gang members in a dusty alley. But he might be the one people are praying for. Dawson frowned. You think this is the spirit? Alvarez smiled softly. I think it's a story too strong to ignore. And maybe. God speaks loudest through stories. While debates simmered in Rome, Father Michael was thousands of miles away, fixing a broken water heater at the shelter. Turn it slowly or the pipe will snap, he warned a teenage volunteer, kneeling beside him. The boy nodded, twisting carefully. Michael's phone buzzed again. He ignored it. It buzzed a second time. Then a third. Sister Joanna leaned out the kitchen window. You should really see this. Michael wiped his hands and followed her inside. The headline flashed on the shelter's dusty TV. Breaking, anonymous Vatican source confirms Michael Carraway, not off the table, in future conclave. He stood still. Stared at it. Blinked once. Then said, turn it off. But the story wouldn't turn off. Everywhere he went, people asked. Some prayed. Others protested. Old priests sent letters, some in support, some furious. One read. You are a man of the people, not the papacy. Stay in the streets where you belong. Another said. This is the moment you were born for. Do not run from it. Michael didn't respond to either. Instead, that night, he went to the chapel, knelt alone, and said simply, "God, what are you doing?" No thunder. No voice. Just the weight of a billion eyes. At the Vatican, Cardinal Neri was preparing a countermove. He picked up the phone and made a private call to a powerful, secretive ally in the Roman Curia. "He needs to be discredited," Neri said flatly. "Before this gets out of hand." A pause. "And if there's nothing to discredit," the voice asked. "Then we manufacture something. God forgive us, if necessary." Back in Phoenix, Michael sat with Sister Joanna on the chapel steps, the night desert breeze moving gently through the air. "This is bigger than you now," she said quietly. "I didn't ask for it. No one ever does." He exhaled. "I just wanted to help people survive the day." She touched his arm. "Maybe that's exactly why they want you." It started small. Like all good smears do. A blog post with poor grammar and no byline appeared on a fringe Catholic website. Was Father Michael involved in firehouse misconduct? Most people scrolled past. A few shared it. Then came a tweet from a verified account, a conservative columnist with a knack for stirring controversy. Why is no one asking serious questions about Father Michael Carraway's past? There's more than prayer behind that collar. Within hours, the story exploded. And the Vatican didn't say a word. In Rome, Cardinal Neri watched the trend rise like a slow-moving tsunami. He didn't smile. But inside, he felt something close to satisfaction. He hadn't fabricated the firehouse scandal. But he'd found it. Buried deep in Pittsburgh's municipal archives, there was an old complaint, a formal inquiry into hazing at Firehouse 17, back when Michael was a rookie. The report didn't name him. Didn't accuse him. But it listed his presence at the station the day a young recruit was hospitalized with a concussion. The case was dropped. No charges. No follow-up. But in the court of public opinion, facts are just scaffolding for headlines. Michael first heard about the story from a volunteer. "Hey, Father M. You might want to check your phone." He looked. Paused. Read the article. Then read it again. His face didn't change. He just handed the phone to Sister Joanna and walked back outside to fix a leaking pipe. By nightfall, every major outlet was running some version of the story. Priest with papal buzz linked to past firehouse injury. Carraway's halo slips, what really happened in Pittsburgh? Hero or hooligan? When asked for comment, the Phoenix diocese released a vague statement of support. But when the Vatican was pressed? Silence. Reporters staked out the shelter. One climbed the fence. Another faked being homeless to get close. Michael stayed out of sight. Not to hide. To process. Because what hurt wasn't the story. It was the memory. He remembered the rookie's name, Danny Ruiz. Hot-headed, sharp, a little cocky. They'd all been messing around. Water hoses. Locker pranks. Nothing cruel. But then it escalated. Danny slipped. Hit his head. Cracked his skull open. Michael had driven him to the hospital himself. Sat with him all night. And the next day, Michael filed a complaint. Against the culture. Against the silence. The others never forgave him. He left the department soon after. Now, years later, the same silence surrounded him. No one printed that part. Until Danny himself spoke up. Late into the next day, a video dropped. Grainy phone footage. Shaky. Danny, now a fire captain in rural Oregon, stood outside his station in uniform. "This is for the record. I'm the guy from the firehouse scandal. And if Father Michael hadn't been there that day, I might have died. He saved my life." Then he turned in the guys who covered it up. He's not perfect. But he's good. And in this world, that's rare. The video went viral. But the damage was done. In the Apostolic Palace, Cardinal Alvarez watched it all unfold. She turned to Dawson. This is the game now. Weaponize virtue against itself. Dawson nodded grimly. The higher he rises, the sharper the knives. Meanwhile, Michael walked the halls of the shelter like always. Replacing broken light bulbs. Cleaning the fridge. Helping a kid prep for a job interview. But in the quiet corners, he felt it. The shift. Some people looked at him differently. As if they were waiting for him to crack. Or confess. Or crawl. Instead, he showed up to morning prayer and read the same passage as always. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. That night, Elon Musk DM'd him. Told you the spotlight burns. You okay? Michael responded. The truth doesn't mind heat. But the smear campaign wasn't done. Within days, a new headline dropped. Exclusive, unsealed counseling records reveal Father Michael's history of depression after family tragedy. They'd gone after his grief now. His therapy sessions, leaked. His struggle after losing Sarah and Emma, dissected by pundits who'd never buried their own. It didn't break him. But it broke something. He went into the chapel. Alone. No collar. No script. Just pain. He looked at the crucifix. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to help. If you want me to keep going, you better speak up soon. Silence. Then the faint knock of Sister Joanna at the door. Someone's here to see you, she said. Media? No. Vatican. Michael stood slowly. Send them in. The man who entered the chapel wasn't what Father Michael expected. No red robe. No gold ring to kiss. No entourage of silent acolytes. Just a short, broad-shouldered priest in his early 50s, wearing a simple black cassock and a weary expression like he'd just stepped off 3 flights and 1 long confession. Father Caraway, the man asked gently. Michael stood. That's me. The man offered a hand. Monsignor Paolo Vitali. I've been sent on behalf of the Secretariat of State. Michael raised a brow. That's not the Vatican PR department, is it? Vitali smirked. No. We handle more delicate matters. They sat in the small back office of the shelter, flanked by a squeaky fan and a calendar featuring St. Francis hugging a raccoon. Vitali declined coffee. I've had enough espresso this week to fuel a satellite. Michael sipped his quietly, waiting. Vitali got to it quickly. You're a problem, Father. Michael smiled. You've got a funny way of opening negotiations. I don't mean it personally. But you've become a disruption. A beloved, unpredictable, media-fueled disruption. Michael leaned back. Did you come here to ask me to stop being liked? Vitali steepled his fingers. No. I came to offer you a way to channel it. He laid a sealed folder on the desk. Thicker than it looked. Embossed with a gold seal. Michael didn't touch it. What's in there? An invitation. From the Pope himself. Michael blinked. Vitali continued, His Holiness requests your presence in Rome. Privately. Not for an audience. For a conversation. Michael didn't answer right away. Vitali added, no press. No pressure. Just a room. You. Him. God. Back in Rome, the Pope, old, soft-spoken, a man with eyes like oceans, was watching the world unravel in headlines and hashtags. He'd led the church through pandemics, war, division. And now he was dying. Silently. He hadn't announced it yet. Only a few knew. But the pain was growing. And his time was short. Get him here, he had told Vitaly. Before the world decides for us. At the shelter, Michael ran a hand through his hair. And if I say no? Vitaly shrugged. Then we book a return flight and this folder disappears. You go back to plumbing and prayers. The world moves on. Or it doesn't. Either way, Rome stays quiet. Michael stared at the folder again. The weight of 1 billion voices pressed on his chest. But also, something else. Something quieter. A nudge. Later that night, Sister Joanna found him on the roof of the shelter, watching the desert stars. He wants to meet me. She nodded. I figured. They want to pull me in. Maybe. Or maybe they just want to see if you're for real. He smiled. What if I'm not? She looked at him like he was a child again. Then at least you'll find that out in the holiest city on earth. 2 days later, Michael stood at Gate 22 in Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport with a duffel bag and an old rosary in his pocket. A volunteer had slipped a note into his bag. He read it before boarding. No matter what happens out there, don't forget who you are to us. He folded the note. Closed his eyes. And boarded the plane. The Vatican doesn't announce unofficial visits. But word always gets out. By the time Michael landed in Rome, whispers were flying through the Curia like wildfire in dry brush. The American priest is here. The one Musk mentioned. He's meeting him. Cardinal Neri clenched his jaw. This was happening faster than he'd expected. He picked up the phone. Activate the Roman file. I want every skeleton, real or imagined. At a hidden Vatican residence used for guests who weren't meant to be noticed, Michael was greeted by a nun in plain clothes. Welcome, Father Caraway, she said, smiling gently. We'll give you some time to rest. His Holiness will see you tomorrow. Michael nodded, stepping into a room no larger than his one back in Phoenix. 1 bed. 1 desk. 1 crucifix on the wall. He dropped the duffel bag and exhaled. The city outside buzzed with centuries. Inside, everything was quiet. That night, he dreamed of fire. Of Emma's laughter echoing in the blaze. Of Sarah holding out her hand. Of a voice whispering, "You are not done yet." He woke before dawn, heart racing. He knelt beside the bed. And he prayed not for answers. Just for enough strength to ask the right questions when the time came. The room wasn't what Michael expected. There were no golden thrones. No guards flanking the door. No dramatic cathedral lighting. Just a sun-drenched library, thick with the smell of old paper and incense, where books leaned like old friends against dusty shelves. A fireplace glowed faintly in the corner. 2 worn chairs sat near it. The Pope was already seated in one. Not in white regalia. Just a soft, gray sweater over his papal collar. He looked tired. But his eyes, God, those eyes, were sharp and clear as morning glass. Father Caraway, he said softly. Come in. Michael stepped forward, quietly, almost sheepishly. You knew my name before I got on a plane. The Pope smiled. I knew your name before the internet did. They sat. No formalities. No cameras. Just 2 men and the centuries between them. Michael waited. But the Pope didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked into the fire and said, Do you know the story of St. Peter's tears? Michael shook his head. After the rooster crowed, after he denied Christ 3 times, Peter ran and wept. But the tears weren't just guilt. They were transformation. From that night on, he was no longer Simon the fisherman. He became the man who would carry the weight of the church. He turned to Michael. I believe you've had your rooster crow. And your tears. Now, the question is, what will you carry? Michael swallowed. I didn't come here to take anything. I know, the Pope said. That's exactly why you were called. There was a long silence. Then the Pope's voice softened, heavier now. I'm dying. Michael's breath caught. Sooner than anyone knows, the Pope continued. And I have not named a successor, nor will I. That is not my right. But I can prepare the way. He leaned in slightly. And you, Father Caraway, are shaking the roots of a system that has gone too long without honest discomfort. Michael shook his head, overwhelmed. I don't belong in marble halls. I belong in alleyways and shelters. The Pope nodded. So did Christ. He stood now, slowly, painfully, and walked to the window. When I was first chosen, I thought I had time. Time to reform the Curia. Time to bring the church closer to the poor. Time to fix what history cracked. He looked out across the rooftops of Rome. But this machine resists change. It resists light. It resists you. Michael rose, unsure whether to stay silent or protest. I've read every file they dug up, the Pope said. They tried to twist your grief into weakness. But grief is not a sin. And pain does not disqualify someone from purpose. Then he turned, walking back slowly, and handed Michael a sealed envelope. Inside, one sentence written in the Pope's hand. He does not seek power, and that is why he must be considered. Michael looked down at the letter. Then up. Why me? The Pope chuckled softly. Because God rarely calls the qualified. He qualifies the called. Back at the Vatican residence that evening, Michael stared out the window at the glowing dome of St. Peter's Basilica. He didn't feel holy. He didn't feel ready. He felt like a man carrying too many names, too many expectations, and not enough answers. But in his pocket was the letter. And somewhere in the city, the church's most ancient forces were already moving. In a marble chamber beneath the Apostolic Palace, Cardinal Neri held a red file marked, Confidential. He opened it. Scanned the pages. His lips curved into the thinnest smile. Time to remind the world, he murmured, that saints bleed like everyone else. He handed the file to an aide. Leak it. But not directly. Let the world feel like it discovered something forbidden. Elsewhere, Elon Musk was watching Michael's flight logs on a private server. He grinned. Game on, he muttered. And far across the ocean, in the shelter where it all began, Sister Joanna lit a candle in the empty chapel and whispered. Protect him, Lord. From enemies. From pride. And most of all, from himself. The headline hit like a slap across the soul. Exclusive. Confidential files reveal Father Michael's struggle with suicidal thoughts after tragic family loss. Under it was a grainy scan of a counseling note. Handwritten. Private. Torn out of a sacred trust and hung up for the world to gawk at. And the headline wasn't just running in fringe blogs this time. It was everywhere. CNN. BBC. The Guardian. Even Catholic Weekly posted it. Michael found out before breakfast. He didn't even check his phone anymore, Sister Joanna called him, voice hollow. They did it, she whispered. They crossed the line. Michael sat down on the edge of the bed in his Vatican guest quarters. The sunlight looked wrong. Like it was shining on someone else's world. He was too numb to cry. Too angry to pray. He just whispered, of course they did. In Rome, Cardinal Neri watched from a quiet chamber lit by a single lamp. Now, he said, sipping his espresso, we see what the man is really made of. His aide cleared his throat. What if this backfires? It won't. The faithful don't want weakness in robes. They want saints. Statues. Not bleeding men with therapy journals. The aide hesitated. Do you? Neri didn't answer. But out in the real world, on Twitter, Reddit, news segments, something strange started happening. The public didn't recoil from Michael's vulnerability. They rallied. A trending hashtag exploded. #HolyHuman. People started sharing their own struggles. Their own traumas. A single mom in Detroit posted a selfie with her child and wrote, "If he can go through that and still get up every morning to help the homeless, maybe I can too." A veteran from Florida recorded a video. "I've fought suicidal thoughts. If this priest still believes in grace, maybe there's still some left for me." It wasn't a scandal. It became a movement. Still, inside Vatican walls, things were cracking. Some cardinals were furious, "He's destabilizing the church." Others whispered, "Maybe this is what we need." And Cardinal Alvarez? She walked into Dawson's office, dropped the newspaper on his desk, and said, "He's not bleeding. He's leading." Meanwhile, Elon Musk fired off a cryptic tweet. Imagine if a spiritual leader actually got what it means to be human in the 21st century. Imagine if grace wasn't PR. The replies were split between fire and fire emojis. Michael, finally alone in the chapel, stared at the crucifix. "You knew I'd break," he said aloud. "So why send me?" Silence. Then, softly, like a ripple in still water, he remembered his daughter Emma's voice from years ago. "It's okay to cry, Daddy. I still think you're brave." That night, Pope Francis sent a handwritten note to Michael's room. "Do not mistake vulnerability for weakness. Christ wept too." Attached was a single line of scripture. "My power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9. At the same time, back in the Phoenix shelter, Sister Joanna stood on the sidewalk holding a cardboard sign that read, "If grace isn't for the broken, then who the hell is it for?" A reporter took a photo. By morning, it was plastered across social media. But the Vatican wasn't through. Not yet. Because Cardinal Neri had saved one last card. A name. One that no one had spoken since the fire. Sarah Caraway. In a shadowed corner of his office, Neri made a quiet call to a European investigative journalist with a reputation for peeling back pain. "I believe the world should know more about the woman behind the tragedy. And what truly happened the night she died." He hung up. Sat back. This wasn't politics anymore. It was war. Back in his room, Michael knelt on the tile floor as Rome slept. He didn't ask God for strength. He asked for silence loud enough to hear what still lived inside him. Because something was coming. He could feel it now. A storm in marble robes and ancient halls. And he would have to walk into it, not with armor, but with truth. The fire wasn't just an event. It was an eraser, wiping away parts of his soul Michael wasn't ready to lose. It had started small, just a flicker in the garage, then the whole house was consumed. He remembered the sound of the flames like an animal in the dark. The heat pressing against the windows. The helplessness. The desperation. But what Michael never told anyone was that he had been the one to start it. It wasn't intentional. But it was reckless. It had been weeks after Sarah's sudden death. She had been the light of his life, his compass through the dark, and when she died in a car accident, it felt like the universe had tilted off its axis. He had been alone. He hadn't been thinking. He hadn't been feeling, just numb. In a panic, a blur of thoughts, he had gone to the shed, grabbing the gas can, splashing it across the driveway in a fog of grief. He had lit a match without thinking, a hollow cry to escape the overwhelming weight of loss. The flames grew too fast, too high, and within moments, the whole house was roaring. His daughter Emma had been asleep upstairs, unaware. Michael was pulled out of his trance by the sound of someone knocking at his door. A small knock. Hesitant. His fingers hovered over the letter Pope Francis had sent him earlier. The words on the page, "My power is made perfect in weakness," were still echoing in his mind. Another knock, louder this time. He looked up. Sister Joanna stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You need to see this," she said, holding out a folder. Inside were photos. Photos of a file. The fire file. And on each page, familiar names and familiar faces: Sarah Carraway, Emma Carraway, Michael Carraway. And beside each name, the same word. Deceased. The first picture showed Sarah's car, the same one she had been driving the night of the crash. But this wasn't just any accident. This was a cold investigation, marked by the word "suspicious." The second picture was a coroner's report, with Emma's name boldly at the top. And next to it, a startling detail Michael hadn't ever known. Autopsy inconclusive. Presumed natural causes. The final page showed something far more terrifying, an unsigned statement that read: Father Michael Carraway, responsible for the deaths of Sarah and Emma Carraway. A chill ran through Michael's veins. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Joanna didn't answer right away. She just handed him the folder, her face hard as stone. "They're going to release this to the press," she said softly. "Cardinal Neri, he's pushing it." Michael's mind went numb. Every step forward in this journey had led him to this very moment, the unveiling of a truth so raw, so jagged, that he wasn't sure how to survive it. The press would tear him apart. His name, his faith, everything he had fought to build would be destroyed. And yet, he remembered that feeling when he had sat in front of the Pope, the quiet weight of the man's words. Christ wept too. Could he really move forward if he let this truth out? That night, as Michael sat alone in his room, trying to gather the pieces of himself, his phone buzzed. A single message from an untraceable number. "We know the truth, Michael. The world will know it soon. The choice is yours. Tell them, or they'll tell you." The clock ticked into the early hours of the morning. Michael thought about his daughter, the look in her eyes just before the fire. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. And now, somehow, he was her villain. He was the one who had turned the light out in her world. He wasn't sure if he was even worthy of the name father anymore. The following morning, Michael took the file to the one person who could help him understand, Pope Francis. When he entered the Pope's private chambers, the aged leader was already waiting for him, hands folded in quiet prayer. "Father Carraway," the Pope said, his voice soft, but resolute. "I know why you're here." Michael set the file down gently in front of him. "How? How could you know?" The Pope smiled faintly. "The truth has a way of making itself known, especially in times of desperation. It doesn't just expose the flaws in our hearts, it exposes our deepest fears." Michael stared at the file in front of him. "It's all lies, Your Holiness. Everything they say, it's not true. I didn't kill them. I loved them. I would never." The Pope placed a hand on the file, silencing him. "But what if the world doesn't care about the truth? What if all they want is the story?" Michael felt the weight of the words sinking in, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his past was becoming the very thing that could tear his future apart. "The world doesn't care about the truth," Michael whispered. "They care about the narrative. The easy one. The one that fits." The Pope leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "Then we must rewrite the narrative." Michael looked up, searching for clarity. "Tell your story, Father," the Pope said. "Not for redemption. Not for salvation. But because the truth, as painful as it may be, will always set you free." Back in his room that evening, Michael took a deep breath and began to type. He would tell the world everything, the truth about Sarah, about Emma, and about the fire. But not as a confession. Not as an excuse. Just as a man who had lived through the storm, and was still standing in its aftermath. He hit send. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The world didn't just react. It exploded. The story broke like a dam, flooding social media, news outlets, and cable networks with coverage of Michael's tragic past. The church's conservative faction seized on the fire. The accusations. The mystery of Emma's death. A priest's dark secret, Father Michael Caraway and the fire that killed his family. A priest's betrayal, did Father Michael cause his family's death? The headlines screamed at him, the shockwaves slamming his chest with every new article, tweet, or broadcast. There was no hiding now. Michael stayed up all night, watching the tide of vitriol rise higher and higher. The accusations, every one of them, cut through him like daggers. But it wasn't the world that stung the most. It was the silence from within the church. The Vatican had gone cold. No statement from Pope Francis. No support from any of the cardinals. Nothing. Just a deep, suffocating silence. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, but only one mattered. Joanna. Meet me at the chapel. It's time to take the next step. By the time he arrived at the chapel, Michael's hands were shaking. He hadn't been able to sleep. Hadn't been able to think. Joanna was there, standing by the altar, a calm presence amid the chaos. You're going to have to face it all, she said softly, the sound of her voice grounding him. The church. The media. The people. And yourself. Michael nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I know. But I don't know how. Joanna smiled faintly. It's not about how. It's about what. What you choose to believe. What you choose to stand for. The chapel doors creaked open behind them, and Michael turned to see a figure step inside. It was Pope Francis. The old man moved with a quiet dignity, but his eyes were fierce, sharp with purpose. Father Caraway, he said, his voice low and steady. It's time we talk. They sat in the pews together, the fire in Michael's chest smoldering beneath the Pope's calm gaze. You've been cast out, Father, Pope Francis said. But the world cannot write your story for you. The world never will. Michael's hands gripped the edges of the pew, his mind racing. Do you understand what I've done? He asked. The fire, the accusations. I'm a monster to them now. The Pope nodded, his expression unreadable. They think they know you, he said. They think they can define your worth by your mistakes. Michael's heart sank. Then what do I do? He whispered. Pope Francis placed a hand on his shoulder. You do what Christ did. Michael's breath caught in his chest. What do you mean? You speak the truth, the Pope said. You stand in the light, even when it burns. You take responsibility for your actions, but you do not let them define you. And above all, you never stop showing grace. Michael's mind spun. This wasn't about redemption. This was about more than that. It was about taking a stand. As they sat in the silence, the door to the chapel opened once again. This time, it was Cardinal Neri. His presence felt like an explosion of tension, cold and calculated. Neri's eyes locked with Michael's as he approached, his footsteps echoing. You've made a mess of everything, Father, Neri said, his tone dripping with venom. The church can't have a leader who's broken. You're a liability. Michael stood, anger rising. A leader? What have I been leading, Cardinal? A system that hides its own wounds? A machine that won't let the truth in? Neri's lips curled into a tight smile. The truth? There's no place for truth in this world, Father. Only control. Michael's heart hammered in his chest as he faced Neri. This man was everything Michael hated about the church, ruthless, self-serving, willing to twist the truth to maintain power. And in that moment, Michael realized something. He wasn't here to fight for redemption. He wasn't here to fight for a title or a position. He was here to fight for the truth. "I'm not afraid of you, Cardinal," Michael said, his voice strong. Neri laughed darkly. "You should be." Michael stood taller, his gaze unwavering. "No. I'm afraid of nothing but the silence. The silence that lets lies live. The silence that lets men like you pretend to hold the truth when you've buried it under your own ambition." Pope Francis looked between them, then stood, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Enough. This battle is not about power. It is about faith." The Pope turned to Michael, his expression softening. "Your past is not the end of your story, Father Caraway. It's only a chapter." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael felt the weight lift off his shoulders. The truth was out. He had nothing left to hide. The reckoning had begun. But so had his fight for something greater. The following days were a blur of tension. The Vatican had become a battlefield, and Michael was caught right in the middle. He had thought that once the truth was out, the pressure would ease. But instead, it had only intensified. Every time he stepped outside his room, he was met with whispers, cold stares, and the occasional glance of pity. The media had not let up. The hashtag Holy Human had continued to trend, but it wasn't the type of support he had hoped for. Instead of coming to him as a symbol of hope, Michael had become the symbol of betrayal, a man who had broken his sacred vows, a priest who had burned his own family, even if it wasn't intentional. He had spent days inside his private quarters, stewing in guilt, reading the endless reports, the blogs, the commentaries, all condemning him. Some priests, once close allies, had started to distance themselves. But he wasn't surprised. The door to his room creaked open. It was Sister Joanna. "Father," she began softly, "they're calling for you to resign." Michael didn't look up. He was sitting by the window, staring out over the city of Rome. It had been a stormy few days, and the rain had left the streets glistening like glass. "I can't resign," he said, his voice low. "Not now. Not after everything I've revealed." Joanna sighed and sat beside him. "You know what they're saying, don't you? The Vatican is divided. Cardinal Neri is pushing for your removal. Some are saying it's the only way for the Church to move forward. They want someone who can restore the image." "I am someone who can restore the image," Michael shot back, his voice suddenly sharp. "Not by hiding from the truth, but by embracing it. That's the only way to heal." Sister Joanna stayed silent for a moment, her eyes focused on him. "You're right, Father. But that won't be enough to stop what's coming." Michael turned to face her. "What's coming?" "The resistance. It's already in motion. They're trying to force your hand." It didn't take long for Michael to understand the full extent of the resistance. The whispers he had heard around the Vatican were turning into something more dangerous. Within the holy walls, a faction of the cardinals and influential priests had begun to push against him, determined to get him removed from his position as a leader. Cardinal Neri wasn't the only one. A new player had entered the game. A dark horse. Cardinal Alvarez. Alvarez was unlike any other leader Michael had met. Where Neri was cold and calculating, Alvarez was charismatic, a master of rallying people to his side. He had a vision of the Church's future, a future that didn't include anyone tainted by scandal, especially not someone as fragile as Michael. The press had already begun to refer to him as the clean slate candidate, the one who would cleanse the Vatican of the mess Father Caraway had created. And Cardinal Alvarez was gaining momentum fast. He had already begun to draw support from some of the Church's most powerful and influential figures. The whispers had turned into direct confrontations. Michael's first real encounter with Alvarez came the next day. They met in a private room, a library tucked away in the farthest corner of the Vatican. The air was thick with tension. "You've caused quite a stir, Father," Alvarez said, his voice smooth and polite, yet cutting. People are losing faith in you. Losing faith in the church because of your choices. Michael stared him down, not blinking. I didn't cause this. The truth did. Alvarez smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Truth is subjective, Father. What's true for you might not be what's true for everyone else. The faithful want a leader who stands strong, who inspires them with certainty. Not someone broken. Michael stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides. I'm not broken. I'm human. That's what they need to see. They need to understand that grace is for the broken, for the ones who fall and get back up. Alvarez's eyes narrowed, and his voice turned colder. You think the faithful want your brand of grace? You're a liability to the future of this church. People like you are why this institution is crumbling. Michael felt his heart race. This wasn't just a conversation. This was a challenge. A battle for the soul of the church. But just as Michael prepared to respond, a third voice cut through the tension. It's not your decision, Alvarez. The voice came from the doorway, and Michael turned to see Pope Francis standing there, his old eyes sharp with conviction. I'm the one who decides the fate of the church, the Pope said, walking into the room. And I've decided that Father Caraway stays. Alvarez's expression faltered, but only for a moment. You're making a mistake, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. Pope Francis met his gaze unflinchingly. Perhaps. But you can't silence the truth with power alone, Cardinal Alvarez. You can't save the church by pretending the broken don't exist. You've forgotten that we are all sinners. All of us. Alvarez took a deep breath, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. Then you're blind, Pope Francis. Blind to what's coming. The Pope turned his back on him. The truth will always come, Alvarez. And it will be heard. As Alvarez stormed out of the room, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Sister Joanna, who had quietly observed the entire exchange, now approached him. You've won the battle, she said, but the war is far from over. Michael nodded. I know. But I have to keep fighting. For the truth. For the church. As they walked back through the Vatican corridors, Michael felt the weight of his purpose more than ever. He was no longer just a priest in crisis. He was a symbol. A beacon. And no matter how dark it got, he wouldn't let the church forget that the light of truth could never be extinguished. The weight of the Vatican's divided factions pressed down on Michael every hour of every day. There were days when he felt like he was suffocating, the tension in the halls of St. Peter's looming over him like an endless storm cloud. The battle had escalated. The media hadn't slowed. In fact, they had become more relentless. Michael had become the focus of every conversation, both within the church and beyond. The news didn't focus on the faith, on God's message, or even on the higher calling of the church. No. It focused on Michael's past, on the accusations that had spread like wildfire across the world. And while some had stood by him, poised in their belief that redemption could be found, others, like Cardinal Alvarez and his supporters, had doubled down. They weren't just calling for Michael's resignation anymore. They were calling for his removal, his excommunication, and even worse, his public disgrace. It was in the dead of night, with the moon casting pale light across the Vatican grounds, when Michael received the letter. It was short, direct, and chilling. Father Michael Caraway. We regret to inform you that your status as a priest is now under formal investigation. The accusations brought against you have reached a point where your public image can no longer be reconciled with the Church's ideals. The investigation will determine your future within the Church. You are hereby relieved of your duties as a priest pending the outcome. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The words felt like a punch in the gut. But it wasn't just the letter. It was what had come after, an ominous knock on his door just minutes later. When Michael opened it, standing there in the dimly lit hallway was Cardinal Neri. There's no turning back now, Neri said coldly. The Vatican has spoken. Michael's jaw clenched. You think this is the end, don't you? I think this is the beginning, Neri replied. Of your downfall. Michael's heart thundered in his chest, but he didn't back down. I won't be silenced. Not by you. Not by anyone. Neri's lips twisted into a cruel smile. You never were good at knowing your place, were you, father? Michael closed the door in his face, his hands shaking. He knew what was at stake now. The battle wasn't about his personal redemption anymore, it was about a war for control over the church itself. The following days brought new twists. The resistance to Michael's presence grew louder, more organized. More of the clergy turned their backs on him, rejecting not only him but the very idea that someone like him could be part of the church's future. The faithful were divided. Some questioned their faith. Others took to the streets, marching with signs of support, calling for the truth to be heard. But the media's focus shifted to the accusations. They wanted blood. They wanted someone to pay for the church's sins, and Michael was now the symbol of those sins. Then came the tipping point. Michael stood before the congregation for what felt like the last time. The pews were filled with familiar faces, friends who had known him for years. But as his gaze swept over them, he saw the doubt in their eyes. The questions that lingered. The confusion. There were whispers in the crowd. Murmurs of fear. The faithful weren't sure what they believed anymore. Michael took a deep breath. His hands trembled as he raised them, holding up the chalice. He began the Eucharistic prayer, his voice low but steady. And then, without warning, a voice from the back of the church shouted, "You're a fraud." The words echoed through the space, like a slap across the face. The congregation fell into silence. The voice came again. "You're nothing but a liar. A disgrace to the faith." The voice belonged to someone Michael didn't recognize, an older man, standing near the back, pointing directly at him. The tension in the air was palpable. Michael's heart raced, but he didn't falter. His gaze met the man's, and something inside him clicked. This wasn't just about the accusations anymore. This was a mob mentality. This was about a church that feared losing control. "Stop," Michael said, his voice carrying across the church. "You don't understand. This isn't about me. This is about the truth." The man's face twisted in anger. "The truth? You've been hiding the truth your entire life, Father." The crowd began to stir. The murmurs grew louder, more aggressive. But Michael didn't back down. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and he knew, in that instant, that this was it. This was the tipping point. "I'm not perfect," Michael said, his voice growing stronger. "I never claimed to be. But I am telling you the truth. I am not the enemy. The enemy is fear. The fear that holds us back from embracing who we are and who we can be." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. "You can keep pointing fingers at me. You can keep trying to tear me down. But you will never silence the truth." For a moment, it felt like the weight of the entire church was hanging in the balance. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. And then, unexpectedly, someone stood. It was Sister Joanna. Slowly, she began to clap, her hands ringing out in the stillness. One by one, others joined in. It wasn't a chorus of support, it was simply recognition. Michael's gaze shifted to the front of the church, where Pope Francis had entered silently. He had been watching. Waiting. "I do not condone what has happened," the Pope said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I understand the necessity of truth. And I stand with Father Caraway." It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was a shift. Michael had taken his stand. The Pope had stood with him. But the battle was far from over. The resistance was still strong, and now, more than ever, Michael understood that this fight wasn't just for him. It was for the soul of the church. The soul of the people. And as he walked out of the church that day, he realized something that had eluded him for so long: he wasn't just fighting for redemption anymore. He was fighting for a new kind of truth. One that embraced flaws. One that saw humanity as it truly was. And that truth would be unstoppable. The days following the church incident felt like a nightmare, each moment more surreal than the last. Michael had thought that standing up in front of his congregation would bring some clarity, some sense of resolution. Instead, it had only deepened the chaos. The Pope's support had certainly given him a moment of hope, but the Vatican's resistance had grown too powerful. Cardinal Alvarez and his supporters were relentless, pulling every string they could to discredit Michael and his message. But Michael had never felt more certain of his purpose. His room in the Vatican was now a sanctuary of sorts, a place where he could hide from the chaos outside. But even here, the weight of the world pressed on his shoulders. The media never stopped. Every news outlet had turned its gaze on him, dissecting his every move, his every word. The church was being torn apart at the seams, and Michael felt like he was caught in the middle of it all, trying desperately to hold it together. One evening, as Michael sat by his desk, sifting through countless papers and emails from supporters and detractors alike, there was a knock at his door. Without looking up, Michael said, "Come in." The door opened slowly, and Sister Joanna entered, her expression grave. "It's bad, Father," she said quietly, her voice tinged with worry. "The protests, they're growing. And Cardinal Alvarez has started calling for a formal investigation into your past. This isn't going away. He's making sure of it." Michael clenched his jaw. "I know." Joanna stepped closer. "We need to take action. The faithful, those who believe in you, they need to see that you're not giving up. You're not backing down." "I'm not backing down," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his mind. "But what can we do? Every day that goes by, I lose more ground." Joanna hesitated, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this. There's still hope." Michael stared out the window, his gaze distant. The world beyond was shifting. The storm clouds that had gathered over the Vatican were now almost literal, thick, dark clouds that threatened to burst open at any moment. "I've been thinking about that," he said, his voice low. "About what hope even means anymore." The next morning, Michael was summoned to the Vatican's Great Hall, where a council of cardinals had gathered to discuss his fate. The room was filled with powerful figures, each one a leader in the church, each one representing a different faction. The tension in the air was thick, and Michael could feel the weight of their gazes on him as he walked in. Cardinal Neri was seated at the head of the table, his cold eyes fixed on Michael. Next to him was Cardinal Alvarez, his face a picture of smug satisfaction. Across from them sat Cardinal Giacomo, an older man with a quiet demeanor, but one whose presence commanded respect. And then there was Pope Francis, seated at the far end of the table, watching everything with an unreadable expression. "Father Caraway," Cardinal Neri began, his voice dripping with condescension. "We've convened here today to discuss your future within the Church. The evidence is clear. Your actions have brought scandal upon this institution." Michael stood tall, his voice unwavering. "I did not bring scandal upon this church. What I did was reveal the truth. The truth that has been buried for far too long." Alvarez chuckled darkly. "The truth? Or your version of it?" "I don't need to justify myself to you, Cardinal Alvarez," Michael replied. "The truth speaks for itself." The room fell silent for a moment, before Pope Francis spoke. His voice was calm, yet heavy with the weight of authority. "Father Caraway," he said, "I've known you for many years. I've watched your journey closely. And I know that your intentions are not rooted in malice. But the reality is, the Church cannot survive this. The damage has been done, and the faithful are losing their trust." Michael's heart sank, but he refused to look away. I will not abandon the truth for the sake of keeping the peace. If the church cannot stand on truth, then it is not the church I've devoted my life to. There was a long silence as the cardinals exchanged glances. Michael could see the shifting allegiances, the quiet discussions that took place behind closed doors. Some of them were with him, but most were not. Cardinal Neri leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "We've made a decision," he said. "Father Caraway, you are to be removed from your position as priest, effective immediately. You are no longer welcome in this institution." The words hit Michael like a slap. It was official. The church had cast him aside. But even as the weight of the decision settled over him, Michael felt a strange calmness. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. He had fought too hard, believed too strongly in what he was doing. He looked at Pope Francis, whose face remained neutral. "What will you do, Holy Father?" Michael asked, his voice steady. "Will you let this happen? Will you let them tear the church apart?" For the first time in the meeting, Pope Francis met Michael's gaze. There was sadness in his eyes, but also something else, something Michael hadn't expected. "I can't stop them, Michael," the Pope said softly. "I've tried. But there is something you can do." Michael was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "Leave," Pope Francis said simply. "Leave the Vatican. Go to the people. Find the truth, and let the faithful see it for themselves. If the church won't accept you, then perhaps it is time you take your message outside these walls." It was the last thing Michael had expected to hear. But as the words sank in, a new sense of clarity began to form. That night, as Michael walked through the empty corridors of the Vatican, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But perhaps this was the next step in his journey, the journey that would lead him back to the people, back to the truth that had always guided him. The storm outside was still raging, but Michael knew that this storm would pass. And when it did, he would be ready. The church might have cast him aside, but the fight was far from over. The air outside the Vatican felt different. It was heavier, yet somehow lighter at the same time. Michael had stood on those holy grounds for years, surrounded by history, faith, and tradition. But now, as the heavy doors of the Vatican closed behind him, he felt as though he had been cast adrift on an open sea, with no map, no compass, and only the stars above to guide him. His exile had begun. For the first time in his life, Michael was free. Free of the suffocating rules that had bound him. Free of the expectations placed on him by the church, and free of the constant scrutiny that came with his position. But the question that gnawed at him, that had followed him from the moment he left the Vatican's halls, was this: what now? What was he supposed to do with this freedom? The truth had driven him this far, but it had also isolated him. The church had abandoned him, and the world outside was filled with uncertainty. The first few days of his journey were a blur. He didn't have much. A small suitcase, a handful of clothes, and his most cherished possession, a small, worn Bible. It had been his companion through the darkest days, and it was the one thing he couldn't part with. Everywhere he went, it was like carrying a piece of his old life with him. But the reality was clear: his old life was gone. The first town he passed through was quiet. It was a small village, nestled in the hills outside Rome, where the daily grind of life went on regardless of the world-shattering events taking place within the Vatican walls. Michael found a small room in a local inn, the kind of place that catered to travelers, those just passing through. As he walked through the cobbled streets, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. People came and went, their lives continuing, indifferent to the man who had once stood at the heart of the world's most powerful religious institution. He had no plan. No real sense of direction. But there was one thing he knew for sure: he couldn't stop. He couldn't go back to the life he had known. He had left the Vatican, but that didn't mean he was free from his mission. His mission was bigger than the church itself. The days turned into weeks, and Michael traveled through Italy, moving from village to village. He lived simply, staying in modest inns, sometimes speaking to locals in the evening about faith, life, and hope. He had lost his position in the church, but the messages he spoke still resonated with those who listened. And then, in one town, everything changed. It was a rainy evening when he found himself in the town square, sitting under the awning of a small café. The storm had driven most people inside, leaving the streets nearly deserted. But Michael wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him, her face hidden behind a veil, her eyes sharp and full of questions. "Father Caraway?" she asked, her voice low, almost reverent. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't used the title of "father" in weeks. It felt foreign now. Still, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been following your story," she continued. "What they've done to you, it's wrong. I know it is. But I also know that you're not done yet. You're meant for something greater." Michael frowned, his gaze shifting to the empty streets. "I don't know about that," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've lost everything. The church has cast me out, and the world has turned its back on me." The woman leaned forward, her expression firm. "What if I told you that you're not alone? That there are others, people who believe in what you stand for, in the truth you've been speaking? People who need you, Father." Michael's breath caught in his throat. "And who are these people?" She smiled, her eyes sparkling with hope. "The ones who need hope. The ones who have been abandoned by the very institution that's supposed to care for them. The ones who have been cast aside just like you." The weight of her words hit him harder than he expected. There were others out there, people who had been pushed to the fringes of the faith, people who felt disconnected from the church, people who needed guidance. And if he was truly going to stand for truth, if he was truly going to make a difference, he couldn't do it alone. He couldn't sit idly by and wait for things to change. Michael had to take the next step. That night, Michael stayed up late, staring out of the window at the dark sky, the rain softly tapping against the panes. He had made a decision. He would no longer be the man trapped by the walls of the Vatican. He wouldn't let his exile be the end of his journey. He was going to take his message to the people, to those who needed it most. He would go to the outskirts of the faith, to the places that the church had forgotten, and he would offer them a new kind of truth, one that wasn't about power, or tradition, or control, but about love, redemption, and acceptance. The next morning, he packed his things and left the inn, heading toward the small town where the woman had told him to go. There were whispers of a community, a group of people who had once been devout but had been cast aside by the church's rigid dogma. They were searching for something more. Michael didn't know what would come next, but he knew that this was his path now. The storm outside was a reflection of the storm within him, uncertain, unpredictable, and yet full of the potential for change. As he arrived in the town, Michael was greeted by a group of people, ordinary people, not the wealthy or the powerful, but those who had been overlooked by society. They were hungry for something real, something tangible. They weren't asking for miracles, only for a chance to feel heard, to feel seen. Michael stood before them, his heart racing, but his conviction unwavering. He could see the hope in their eyes. They weren't waiting for a savior, they were waiting for someone who could offer them truth. Someone who would speak to them as equals, not as subjects. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I've been told that I'm no longer welcome in the church. That I've been cast out. But I stand before you today to tell you that the truth cannot be cast aside. The church has forgotten what it means to love without condition, to forgive without judgment. But I will not forget. And neither should you." The crowd fell silent, hanging on every word. Michael knew that this was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be long and difficult. There would be opposition, there would be doubt, and there would be moments when he felt like giving up. But he also knew this, he had finally found his true calling. He wasn't meant to be a part of an institution anymore. He was meant to be a voice for those who had no voice. The days that followed Michael's speech in the small town were a whirlwind. Word spread quickly of a man who had once stood at the center of the church's power, only to be cast aside for speaking the truth. Michael wasn't just a priest now, he had become a symbol, a beacon for those who had lost faith in the institution they once loved. But it was not just the disillusioned faithful who came. It was the broken-hearted, the lost, the confused, the ones who had never felt welcome in the grand halls of the Vatican, those who had been told their faith wasn't enough, or worse, that they weren't enough. As Michael walked through the streets of this small town, he felt a new energy surrounding him. The people who had gathered weren't just curious, they were desperate. Desperate for something to hold on to, desperate for hope. His first few meetings with the group were quiet, humble affairs. They met in a small community hall, a room with chipped walls and old wooden floors. The air was thick with the weight of the past, with the legacy of generations who had long ago been abandoned by the church. "Tell us, Father Caraway," one of the first to speak up asked, "what will we do now? What do we believe in? We've been cast aside, abandoned by the very people we trusted." Michael's heart ached as he looked out over the faces of the gathered crowd. They were just like him, searching for meaning, for something real in a world that had left them behind. But now, more than ever, Michael knew that the message of hope, of unconditional love and forgiveness, was not something the church could contain. It had to be something that transcended the walls of Rome. "We will start anew," Michael said, his voice steady. "We will take the truth beyond these walls, beyond the dogma, beyond the politics. We will build a community where everyone is welcome, where love is the foundation, and where we are all equal in the eyes of God." The people nodded, some with tears in their eyes. They had been yearning for this kind of message, this kind of leadership. And for the first time in years, they believed it was possible. Over the next few weeks, the group grew. Word spread quickly, and more people came to hear Michael speak. Each time he spoke, it was as if a little more of the darkness that had clouded his heart began to lift. He was no longer just a man standing alone, he was the center of a movement, a light in the midst of a storm. But there were those who watched from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One evening, as Michael was preparing to speak at the town square, he was approached by a familiar figure, a man he had not seen in months, but whose presence he recognized immediately. "Father Caraway," the man said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." It was Father Dominic, one of the priests who had once stood beside him in the Vatican. But now, his once pristine robe was worn and frayed, his face shadowed with concern. "Dominic," Michael greeted him, a mix of surprise and confusion in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to warn you," Father Dominic said, glancing over his shoulder. "The cardinals, they've taken notice of what you're doing. They're not happy. They've started to tighten their grip. There are whispers of something bigger, something much more dangerous. They won't stop until they've silenced you." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He had known that his actions had consequences, but hearing it from someone still within the Vatican made it all the more real. "Do you think they'll come for me?" Michael asked, his voice steady, though his mind raced with the possibilities. "They already have," Father Dominic replied. "But it's not just you they're after. It's the people you've gathered. They're worried about what's happening here. This community of yours, it's dangerous to them. It challenges everything they stand for." Michael felt a surge of defiance. "Let them come," he said, his voice stronger than he had intended. "Let them try to tear us apart. We will not be silenced. Not now. Not ever." Dominic shook his head. "I wish I could believe that," he murmured. "But the power they hold, it's not just in Rome. It's everywhere. They've already started to gather support, and they won't stop until they've destroyed what you've built here." Michael didn't respond immediately. He knew that Father Dominic was right. The Vatican's reach extended far beyond Rome. But he also knew that he couldn't stop now. He couldn't give in to fear. Not when so many people were depending on him. "I didn't ask for this fight," Michael said quietly, looking out toward the horizon. "But it's the fight I have to take. The truth will not be buried. Not again." The next morning, Michael gathered his followers in the town square. Word of the growing movement had spread like wildfire, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. This wasn't just a gathering of disillusioned believers. This was something bigger. Something more profound. Michael stood before the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been faced with countless challenges, with doubt and fear clawing at him from all sides. But as he looked out at the sea of faces before him, each one filled with hope, with expectation, he knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for. "The road ahead will not be easy," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "We are standing on the edge of something new. A new kind of church. A place where love, not power, guides us. Where truth, not tradition, leads the way. And where we are not bound by the walls of an institution, but by the love of one another." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the square. Michael had given them something they had been longing for, something real, something that connected them all. But even as the cheers rang out, Michael knew that this was only the beginning. The Vatican's grip on the world was still strong, and they would not let him go without a fight. That night, Michael stood outside the community hall, looking out at the stars. There was a storm on the horizon, a dark cloud that he couldn't ignore. But he was no longer afraid. The fight had begun. And he was ready. The days following Michael's passionate speech were filled with both triumph and uncertainty. The movement he had sparked was growing, but with that growth came heightened risks. It wasn't just the people who believed in him who were watching, it was the Vatican. And the Vatican wasn't known for letting dissent go unchallenged. Michael felt the weight of that responsibility with every passing day. His followers looked to him for guidance, for strength, for hope. They trusted him with their faith, and with their lives. But even as he rallied them with promises of love, acceptance, and unity, he knew that the storm was coming. It was a crisp morning when the first sign of the storm arrived. A messenger came to the town square, a figure cloaked in shadow, carrying a letter sealed with the official insignia of the Vatican. Michael took the letter with trembling hands, a sense of foreboding creeping over him. He'd known this day was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the cold reality of it. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the words quickly. "By the authority of the Holy See, you are hereby excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Your teachings, your actions, and your influence upon the faithful are deemed heretical. You are to cease all activities immediately. Failure to comply will result in severe consequences." The letter dropped from his hands, fluttering to the ground like a piece of discarded paper. Michael stood frozen for a moment, his mind reeling. Excommunication. It wasn't unexpected, but the reality of it hit him like a punch to the gut. "You knew this was coming," Father Dominic said, stepping forward from the shadows where he had been watching. His voice was grim, but there was a sense of understanding in his eyes. "I knew," Michael replied quietly, his fingers still trembling slightly. "But it doesn't make it easier." Dominic nodded. "The Vatican has resources, connections that reach far beyond Rome. They've always been able to silence those who speak out. And they won't hesitate to do it now. You've become a threat." Michael looked out over the square. The people who had gathered here had placed their trust in him, believing that he could lead them to something better, something pure. And now, the very institution that had once defined his life was threatening to take it all away. But as he watched the faces of his followers, he felt something stir within him. This wasn't just his fight. It was theirs too. "We can't back down," Michael said, his voice firming as he spoke. "We won't be intimidated. This isn't just about me. It's about what we've built here. It's about the truth we stand for." Dominic's expression softened, but he didn't argue. Then you'll need to be ready. The Vatican doesn't lose quietly. And there are those within your own movement who may falter in the face of pressure. Michael nodded. He knew the stakes had just been raised, but there was no turning back now. That night, Michael sat in the quiet of his room, his Bible open in front of him. The words on the page seemed to blur as his thoughts raced. How had it come to this? He had never asked for power or control. All he had wanted was to speak the truth that had been hidden behind the gilded walls of the Vatican for too long. But the truth was dangerous. And the more people believed in it, the more dangerous it became. He reached for the worn Bible, his fingers tracing the edges of the pages. It had always been his anchor in times of doubt, his constant companion. Now, as he read the familiar verses, he found a strange sense of comfort. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I with them, he whispered to himself, the words resounding in his heart. If this is the path I must walk, then I will walk it with them. The following days were filled with whispers and hushed conversations. Michael could feel the tension growing, a quiet storm building in the background. His supporters, those who had come to trust in his message, were standing strong, but even they couldn't deny the growing pressure. The Vatican's condemnation was a powerful weapon. And now, the world beyond their small town was taking notice. A visit from a local news reporter brought the first of many media attention. The reporter, a young woman named Clara, had heard about the movement and wanted to understand what was driving Michael and his followers. She had seen the excommunication letter, and she knew that this was a story that could change the world. Why continue this fight? Clara asked as she sat across from Michael, her recorder on the table between them. The Vatican has made it clear they want you gone. They've labeled you a heretic. Why not just walk away from it all? Why risk everything? Michael leaned forward, his gaze steady and resolute. Because the truth cannot be silenced, he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. The Vatican is afraid of the truth. They've built their empire on fear and control. But we don't need their approval. We don't need their permission. We stand for something greater than that. Clara paused for a moment, absorbing his words. She had come into the interview skeptical, ready to report on another so-called radical figure. But something in Michael's eyes, something in the way he spoke, made her question everything she thought she knew about the church and its authority. Do you think the church will come after you? She asked, the question hanging in the air. I know they will, Michael replied, his voice calm but firm. But I also know that they won't win. The truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep they try to bury it. As the days passed, the storm of opposition only grew louder. The Vatican sent more letters, more warnings, and even began to rally its supporters against Michael's movement. Rumors spread that powerful figures within the church were preparing to take legal action, to accuse Michael of spreading heresy and causing division among the faithful. But through it all, Michael remained unshaken. His resolve was like iron. The greater the pressure, the more determined he became. And the more his followers grew in strength, too. They began organizing in secret, preparing to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their movement wasn't just about Michael anymore, it was about a collective desire for change, a shared belief in the message of love and truth that transcended the walls of the Vatican. One evening, as Michael prepared to address the growing crowd outside the town hall, he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw Father Dominic standing in the doorway. "You're ready," Dominic said, his voice tinged with a note of admiration. Michael didn't respond immediately. He was still processing everything, the weight of the coming battle, the knowledge that his words and actions had far-reaching consequences. But as he met Dominic's gaze, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. He had a community, a purpose, and a mission that could not be erased. "Let's do this," Michael said, his voice strong, unwavering. The storm was coming. But so was the light. The days that followed the media storm were tense. The Vatican had made its move, pulling every string it could, leveraging its network to discredit Michael and his growing movement. Cardinal Bianchi himself had issued a public statement condemning Michael's actions and labeling him a heretic, a dangerous man who threatened the very foundation of the church. But in the face of all this, Michael felt an undeniable sense of clarity. The stakes had never been higher. He couldn't afford to turn back now. His people, his community, depended on him. They believed in him. It was no longer just about faith, it was about standing up to power, to injustice. It was about fighting for something bigger than himself. As the days grew darker, Michael held a series of clandestine meetings with his inner circle. He had received word that the Vatican was making its move. They were bringing in high-powered lawyers, political figures, and even law enforcement to break apart his movement. The church had the resources, the money, and the influence. Michael's group had nothing but their unwavering belief in their cause. "We need to make a stand," Michael said, pacing back and forth in the dimly lit room. "We need to make sure they know that we will not back down. That we are not afraid." Father Dominic stood in the corner, arms crossed, his expression grim. He had seen the dangers that came with standing up to such a powerful institution, but he also knew that there was no turning back. "They've already begun to rally against us," Dominic said. "There are reports that they've sent agents to infiltrate our group. They'll do anything to discredit us, to make us seem like extremists." Michael stopped pacing, turning to face his friend. "Then we'll show them who the real extremists are." Michael's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Clara, the young reporter who had interviewed him days earlier, entered with a grim look on her face. "I have something important," she said, holding up a folder of documents. "I've been digging into the Vatican's financial records. It's not just about theology, Father. It's about money, power, and control. I've found things that could change everything." Clara handed the folder to Michael, who opened it carefully. Inside were detailed accounts, ledgers, and private communications that revealed a deep web of corruption within the Vatican. The Church's wealth was not just about tithes and donations, it was about investments, offshore accounts, and questionable dealings with powerful figures across the globe. "This," Michael muttered, his eyes scanning the papers. "This is what they don't want people to see." Clara nodded. "They've been covering up their actions for years. The excommunication isn't just about you. It's about keeping their secrets buried." With the new evidence in hand, Michael felt a surge of determination. The Vatican had underestimated him. They had thought that by silencing him, they could make the truth disappear. But now, with this damning evidence, they had no choice but to face the reality of what they had done. "We have a choice," Michael said, his voice stronger than ever. "We can either let them bury us, or we can take this to the world. We have to expose them. If we do nothing, then we're just complicit in the lies." Father Dominic nodded slowly. "You're right. We can't hide anymore. But we need to be careful. If we push too hard, they'll strike back with everything they have." Michael turned to face his supporters, gathered in the room. Their faces were a mix of fear, hope, and resolve. They knew the risks. But they also knew the cost of staying silent. "We've come this far," Michael said, his voice firm. "We can't stop now. For too long, the truth has been hidden behind walls of power and influence. We have a chance to bring it into the light. And I will stand with you. Together, we can change the world." As the days passed, preparations were made for the final stand. Michael and his group began reaching out to journalists, influencers, and activists who had been critical of the Vatican's practices. It wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about creating a movement that couldn't be ignored. But they knew the Vatican wasn't going to take this lying down. The Church had already begun to escalate its attacks. Rumors of smear campaigns, public character assassination, and even physical threats against Michael's life began to circulate. And as the movement gained more momentum, the stakes only continued to rise. One evening, as Michael was preparing for another public speech, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Father Caruso, one of the most influential cardinals in the Vatican. His presence in the small town was a clear sign that the church was getting serious. He walked into the room, his face cold and unreadable. "Father Caraway," Caruso began, his voice deep and authoritative. "I've come to offer you one last chance to end this madness. The Vatican is willing to offer you a position, one that could allow you to continue your work without further consequence. If you stop now, you can avoid the full wrath of the Church. You and your followers will be spared." Michael's gaze was unwavering as he met Caruso's eyes. "And what would that position be? A puppet to do the Vatican's bidding? To keep quiet while the truth is buried?" Caruso's expression tightened, but he held firm. "You are a man of faith, Father. You know what's at stake. You have a choice." "I've already made my choice," Michael replied, his voice calm but resolute. "I stand with the people. And I will not be bought. Not by you, and not by the Vatican." The cardinal's eyes narrowed, his voice growing colder. "Then you will regret this decision. You've made enemies that you cannot even begin to comprehend. And I will continue to stand with those who believe in love, justice, and truth," Michael said, his voice unwavering. "If the Church wants war, then war it will be." With that, Father Caruso turned and walked out of the room, leaving Michael to face the storm that was now inevitable. The following week, Michael delivered the most important speech of his life. Standing before a sea of his supporters, he revealed the documents Clara had uncovered. He exposed the corruption, the lies, and the manipulation that had been hidden for centuries. And as the truth poured out, Michael felt a shift. The world was watching. The Vatican could no longer control the narrative. It had been exposed. That night, as Michael stood in the middle of the town square, he looked out at the sea of faces. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had begun to turn. No matter what happened next, he knew one thing for sure. The truth was out. And nothing could take it back. The following days were a blur of chaos and uncertainty. The Vatican had not wasted any time in responding to Michael's public exposure of their corruption. They had swiftly moved from threats to action, pressuring media outlets to discredit him, rallying high-ranking political figures to label him a fraud, and even launching a campaign of personal attacks against him and his followers. It seemed as though the weight of the Church was coming down on them all at once. But amidst it all, Michael stood resolute. He had taken the fight to the Vatican, and now, they were taking it back to him. The battle lines were drawn, and there would be no going back. It was late in the evening when the first wave of retaliation hit. Michael had just finished a meeting with his closest advisors when the door to the small church room was thrown open. A figure stepped inside, breathing heavily, and a sense of urgency filled the air. "They've come for us," the messenger said, his voice trembling. "They've sent the authorities. The Vatican's agents are here." Michael's heart raced, but his face remained calm. He had known this day would come, but to face it in such a direct manner was another thing entirely. "What do we do?" one of his followers, a young woman named Emma, asked, her voice wavering with fear. "How do we fight this?" "We stay calm," Michael replied, his voice firm and unwavering. "We stand together. We don't let them break us." As the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the streets outside, Michael turned to Father Dominic, who stood in the corner, his face grim but resolute. "They're coming for us," Dominic said quietly. "I knew this day would come. But I didn't expect it to happen so soon." Michael nodded. "Neither did I. But we can't back down now. We've come too far." Outside, the once peaceful town was now in chaos. The Vatican's agents had arrived in force, police, security personnel, and even hired mercenaries. Their mission was clear: to dismantle Michael's movement and remove him from the public eye once and for all. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. Michael and his followers moved quickly, spreading out into small groups, using the narrow alleys and hidden paths of the town to avoid detection. It was clear that the Vatican had more than just legal authority at their disposal, they had the power to crush this movement, and they weren't afraid to use it. As Michael led a small group through the back streets, the sounds of shouting and sirens grew louder. The town was under siege. "We need to get to the church," Michael said, his voice sharp with urgency. "It's the one place they won't expect us to be." Dominic, Emma, and the others nodded, following him closely as they moved through the shadows. The church was their final stronghold. If they could make it there, they could regroup, strategize, and perhaps even turn the tide against their adversaries. But as they neared the church, Michael heard a familiar voice calling out to him from the darkness. "Father Caraway." Michael stopped in his tracks, instinctively reaching for the concealed pistol tucked beneath his coat. But when he turned, he saw a familiar face, Clara, the young reporter who had stood by him through it all. "Clara?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" She stepped closer, her expression tense but determined. "I've been following them," she said. "I know what they're planning. The Vatican's agents aren't just coming for you, they're coming for everyone who stands with you. They're planning to make an example out of us." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He had known the risks, but hearing Clara's words put it all into perspective. This wasn't just about silencing him, it was about silencing every voice that dared to question the power of the Vatican. "We need to get out of here," Dominic said, his voice laced with urgency. "They'll be on us any minute now." "No," Michael replied, his eyes hardening with resolve. "We fight. We show them that we're not afraid. We can't let them take us down without a fight." The church was their last stronghold, but Michael knew that if they were to survive, they would need more than just willpower, they needed a plan. As the group entered the darkened building, Michael quickly organized them into positions. The large, hollow space of the church could provide cover, but only if they were prepared for the worst. The doors to the church creaked open, and the storm broke in full force. Vatican agents poured in from all directions, surrounding the building with a show of overwhelming force. Michael could hear the sound of heavy boots and the clatter of weapons being drawn. It was no longer just about him, it was about his entire movement. "Everyone, stay in position," Michael ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We'll hold the line here." Father Dominic moved to the side, checking the rear exits, while Clara began recording everything on her camera, knowing that the truth of what was happening would need to be shared with the world. The first volley of gunfire rang out, shattering the silence. The agents had no intention of negotiation, they came with force, intending to break the resistance by any means necessary. The church erupted into chaos. Michael's followers fought back, using every weapon and tactic they had learned. It wasn't a battle they had prepared for, but it was a battle they would not lose. In the midst of the chaos, Michael found himself face to face with Father Caruso, the same cardinal who had offered him a deal to surrender. Now, he stood before Michael, his face twisted with fury. "This is your last chance, Father Caraway," Caruso sneered, brandishing a weapon. "You can't win this. You'll die here. Do you understand that?" Michael's eyes locked with Caruso's, his voice unwavering despite the chaos around them. "No," he said simply. "I will not die here. This is just the beginning." As the battle raged on, Michael's resolve only strengthened. His followers were holding their ground, and with the world now watching, they were no longer fighting in vain. The truth was out, and nothing could change that. But as the first light of dawn began to break, Michael knew that the storm was far from over. What came next would decide the future of his movement. Would they be crushed under the weight of the Vatican's power? Or would they emerge victorious, proving that no force could silence the truth? The battle had raged on through the night. The church, once a symbol of sanctuary and peace, had become a battleground. Dust and smoke filled the air, mingling with the bitter scent of gunpowder. Michael's followers fought with a courage and resolve that seemed almost supernatural. Their commitment to truth had become their weapon, and in the face of overwhelming force, they held their ground. Outside, the Vatican's forces had begun to regroup, trying to tighten their grip on the situation. But inside the church, there was still hope. Michael knew that this final confrontation would not be easily won, but it could change everything. It was the last stand of truth against centuries of corruption, the final test of whether the light of justice could truly break through the darkness. "Stay strong," Michael shouted, his voice echoing in the church's vast hall. The sound of gunfire and shouts outside was deafening, but inside, there was only the singular focus of those who had made the choice to fight. "We fight for the truth, for the world to see what's been hidden for far too long." Father Dominic, standing by Michael's side, nodded grimly. "We can't let them break us. They want us to fear them, to silence us. But they're wrong. The world has already seen the truth." Clara, who had been documenting the entire ordeal, looked up from her camera, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "Michael, they're closing in on the exits. We won't be able to hold this position for much longer. What's our plan?" Michael met her gaze, his face hardening with resolve. "The world's watching. We can't just survive this, we need to ensure that they can't bury the truth. We'll push forward. If we're going to go down, we go down fighting for the future." Just then, the doors of the church burst open, and the Vatican's forces flooded in, led by none other than Cardinal Caruso. His face was set in grim determination, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes as he saw the strength of the resistance. "This is it, Father Caraway," Caruso's voice rang out, cold and final. "You've lost. Surrender, and we'll ensure a quick end. Resist, and it'll be far worse." Michael stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I've already told you, Cardinal. There's no turning back for me. The truth is out. It's too late to stop us." Caruso's lips twisted into a thin smile. "You think your little movement will change anything? The Vatican has stood for millennia. You're nothing." But Michael wasn't listening. He turned to his followers. "This isn't about me. This is about all of us. This is about the people who have been silenced for centuries. This is about truth, justice, and love. We've already won, because we've brought the truth to the world. They can't take that back." Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder, and the whirring of helicopters filled the air. News crews had gathered from all over the world, broadcasting live footage of the battle inside the church. The Vatican's iron grip on the narrative was slipping away. The truth was too loud, too undeniable. No amount of power, no matter how long the church had held it, could silence the people anymore. Cardinal Caruso's expression darkened as he saw the cameras outside, and he turned to his forces. "Move in. Take them down." The agents charged forward, but before they could make their move, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed from the rear of the church, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakable. Suddenly, the doors to the church flung open once more, and a wave of reinforcements poured into the hall. It was the same group of influential journalists and activists who had stood with Michael from the beginning. They had rallied together, bringing their own forces to join the resistance. The battle was no longer just about Michael, it was about a global movement, a force of people united by truth. Michael's eyes widened as he saw the flood of support. This wasn't just his fight, it was everyone's fight. And they weren't going to back down. Father Caruso's face went pale as he watched the situation shift. The Vatican's power had always relied on fear, control, and secrecy. But now, in the bright light of exposure, they were losing their grip. Michael turned to the gathered forces, his heart swelling with pride. "This is it," he said, his voice resolute. "We are the change we've been waiting for. The Vatican has used its power to silence the world for too long. But no more. The truth is louder than their lies. The truth will set us free." A loud cheer erupted from his followers. The Vatican's agents hesitated, their weapons still drawn, but the power of the resistance was undeniable. It was a new era. The era of truth. And then, as if by fate, the sound of police sirens echoed through the church's courtyard, followed by the unmistakable sight of a high-ranking government official stepping out of a vehicle. It was Senator Garcia, the same politician who had once been a vocal critic of Michael's movement. But now, he had come to stand with him. "I'm here to ensure that justice is done," Garcia announced, stepping forward and holding up a legal document. "The Vatican has overstepped its boundaries. These charges of corruption, abuse of power, and manipulation are too serious to ignore any longer." Michael's heart raced as he took in the sight of Garcia's official declaration. The Vatican's power was officially under scrutiny. The world was no longer on the Church's side, it was on the side of truth. Father Caruso's face twisted with fury as he realized that his forces were no longer in control. His grip on power was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "I won't let you destroy the Church," Caruso snarled. Michael took a deep breath, his voice calm but firm. "It's not the Church we're destroying, Cardinal. It's the lies that have held it captive. It's the corruption that has poisoned it. We are fighting for a better future, for all of us." And with that, the Vatican's reign of fear began to crumble. The news of the Vatican's exposure spread like wildfire. Within days, powerful figures from around the world began to call for an independent investigation into the Church's practices. Long-held secrets were being revealed, and the public outcry was overwhelming. Michael, once an outcast and heretic, had become the leader of a global movement for truth and justice. The world had changed. The Vatican, once an unstoppable force, now faced a reckoning unlike any it had ever known. In the days that followed, Michael and his followers began to rebuild, not just their movement, but a new way of thinking, one based on transparency, love, and justice. They had taken on the most powerful institution in the world and won. Michael stood at the front of a gathering of thousands, his face illuminated by the rising sun. The truth had won. And with it, a new era had dawned. The weeks following the Vatican's downfall were filled with a sense of cautious optimism, tempered by the realization that the fight was far from over. The truth had been exposed, and the world had responded, but the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. Michael and his followers, once seen as rebels and outcasts, now found themselves at the forefront of a movement that had shaken the very foundation of power. But in the quiet moments, when the dust had settled and the adrenaline of the battle had faded, Michael found himself reflecting on the true cost of their victory. He stood on the steps of the church, looking out over the crowd that had gathered. It was a gathering of people from all walks of life, activists, journalists, ordinary citizens, each one of them a symbol of the new world they had helped create. For the first time in years, there was a sense of peace in the air. But peace, Michael knew, was fragile. The resistance wasn't just about toppling a powerful institution. It was about the transformation of a collective mindset. It was about the idea that power should not be held by the few at the expense of the many. It was about bringing light to the darkest corners of the world and shining it on the truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. Michael turned to Father Dominic, who had stood by his side through every twist and turn of this journey. "We did it," Michael said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. Dominic nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We did. But it's not over. This is just the beginning." As the world began to recover from the shock of the Vatican's fall, there were ripple effects in every corner of society. Governments, once afraid to challenge the power of the Church, now found themselves compelled to act. Investigations into corruption and abuse within the Church spread worldwide, and a wave of reforms began to take shape. But this was not just a political revolution, it was a cultural one. For the first time in centuries, people began to ask the hard questions. They no longer accepted authority at face value. They demanded transparency. They demanded accountability. And they demanded change. Michael, who had once been a pariah, was now viewed as a symbol of this new age. He was called upon by governments and global leaders to offer his insights, but he knew his work wasn't about personal recognition. It had never been about him. It was about something bigger. Months later, Michael found himself in a small conference room, surrounded by a team of diplomats, journalists, and reformers. The world was beginning to shift, but there was still so much to be done. He had received an invitation from the United Nations to speak about the future of global governance and the need for transparency in international institutions. It was a moment he had never imagined possible when he had first started this journey. As he prepared for the speech, his mind wandered back to the beginning, back to that fateful day when he had first taken the step to expose the truth. He had faced the daunting task of standing up against the most powerful institution on earth, and now, he was about to speak to the world about what came next. "What will you say?" Father Dominic asked, as if reading his mind. The two of them stood by the window, looking out at the bustling city streets below. Michael paused, thinking carefully. "I will tell them that change is possible. That we can build a future where truth and love guide us, not fear and corruption. And that the work isn't over. The fight for transparency, justice, and love continues." Dominic placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not just speaking for yourself, Michael. You're speaking for everyone who has ever been silenced. And for everyone who believes in something better." On the day of his speech, the world was watching. The hall was packed, cameras from every major news outlet focused on the man who had brought down a centuries-old institution. Michael stood before the assembly of world leaders and the press, his heart beating in his chest. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. But as he stepped up to the podium, he knew that his words were no longer just his, they were the words of a global movement. He cleared his throat and began. "Today, we stand on the precipice of something monumental. We've witnessed the collapse of an institution that has shaped the world for centuries. But with that collapse comes a unique opportunity. An opportunity to rebuild, to reshape, to chart a new course for the future." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces in front of him. "We no longer need to live in a world where the powerful can hide in the shadows. We no longer need to accept corruption as the price of progress. We are capable of creating a world built on transparency, love, and respect for all people. We have learned the hard way that power must be shared, that the truth must be heard, and that every voice matters." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "This is not just about one man or one movement," Michael continued. "This is about all of us. It's about the people who stand together in the face of oppression, who fight for what is right, even when it seems impossible. The Vatican's fall was a wake-up call, but it's just one chapter in a much larger story. The story of a world waking up to the truth, and demanding better." As he finished his speech, the room erupted into applause. Michael felt a wave of emotion wash over him, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, but the world had been forever changed. Years passed, and the changes Michael had fought for began to take root. New governments emerged, focused on transparency and accountability. The church underwent deep reforms, its once immense power now reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Michael's influence spread, not just through politics, but through the hearts and minds of people around the globe. And in the quiet moments of reflection, Michael knew one thing for certain: he had not fought for fame, or for glory, or even for personal victory. He had fought for something much bigger than himself. He had fought for a new dawn. A new dawn where truth, love, and justice would always rise above the darkness. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?